Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 114. I'm joined today by the head of sports science and medicine at Ipswich Town, Jimmy Reynolds. So Jimmy, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure to be on.
Now, this has been a long time coming, this one. We were just talking about a mutual friend in Mark Armitage has been nagging the both of us to get this done. So we're finally going to please him and get it recorded. So thanks to Mark for the recommendation of yourself. And thank you to you for giving up your time for coming on, mate.
No idea why he's recommended me, but no, it's a pleasure. And it's been nice to see, obviously, through this difficult period, the podcast is coming out regularly. There's some great people on it, and I'm humbled to be part of it, put it that way.
Brilliant. No, it's great to have you on. So do you want to kick us off? And I've said this on a numerous episodes before. Our conversation before we started recording should have been recorded because we've touched on loads of stuff already. But let's get into the actual podcast now. Just take us through your background. Let's hear about your background and what led you up to your role.
Okay, so going right back to the beginning, I'm a chartered physiotherapist. So back in 2004, I trained as a physiotherapist through the University of Hertfordshire. For me, I always had a fascination with the human body, and physiotherapy was something that I was always interested in from a very early age, having had some as a child. The ironic thing is, I never said I'd work in football. I loved football, and through my young physiotherapy career, I did, as a student, I worked with Manchester City, got some experience there. When I qualified, I worked in the NHS as a physiotherapist, and I had some experience at Crystal Palace as well. But I specialised as a neuromuscular physiotherapist, and I progressed my way in the NHS. I was really fortunate as a young physiotherapist to be exposed to some really good physiotherapy practitioners, some real good specialists, and a lot of fantastic colleagues. And interestingly, as a physiotherapist, I was interested in chronic low back pain. So I was almost so far away from athletes. I was, really interested in dealing with people with 10, 15, 20 years worth of back pain, the psychosocial effects of it, changing their pain and their movement behaviors. But a lot on the side, I always did a little bit of football work. I obviously love football. So back in 2008, I started working with Ipswich Town as a part-time physiotherapist. And as I said, I never said I'd work in football, but I fell into it. I was offered a position here way over 10 years ago, and I fell into it. And I thought to myself, well, if the demands of football are too much, I'll leave. But over 10 years down the line, I'm still here. So that obviously says a lot for the environment. So for me, as I shifted my focus into working with football players and athletes, you just get dragged into it, and you start working with more and more people. You start working with some fantastic players and some high level staff in terms of surgeons, world leading surgeons, and you just get dragged into the fun of it, really. So I started off as a physiotherapist in Ipswich Town with the academy, and over the years I've progressed to being head of sports science and medicine for the academy. So, and I was part of the academy that, this was pre-E-Treble-P. We were employed to produce players for our first team. That is what we were there for. And E-Treble-P came around and was fantastic in one sense, in the sense that it allowed us to invest in more staff, more physios, more strength and conditioning coaches, psychologists, nutritionists. And it gave us a platform to be able to do that. But obviously the recategorization occurred as well. And what we did find is that we were in a situation where we became a Category 2 academy because of the club's finances. So we, as a club, were then positioned in a slightly different way. Our finances were slightly less, so we had to think differently. So over the years, we've invested in certain areas of the football club, and we've had to think differently and think outside the box to be able to progress the sports science and medicine department with perhaps less funding. But it's been a really enjoyable time for me. As an academy, we consistently produce young professionals into the senior game, and it's something that we've got a history of doing. And it's something that as a club we really enjoy. And then, so I've been doing that for over 10 years now. And in the last year, I've also on the side, myself and my wife, who's Lindsay, who's also a physiotherapist, have started a private physiotherapy practice called Alpha Physiotherapy, which is based in Ipswich. And that's been a really enjoyable challenge for the both of us, alongside working full-time in football as well. So it's been a challenge, and it's been a really steep learning curve. You know, why we decided to open a business and then COVID come along and hit us, you know, we'll never know. But it's been a really good challenge for us to think outside the box. And it's a really enjoyable thing for me. I'm now seeing, you know, some footballers outside of Ipswich Town in that business, but also a lot of other sports and a lot of other clientele. So we're seeing a complete host of different problems in that business, which is fantastic for us. So that's kind of me in a nutshell.
No, brilliant. And just before, because we'll go into a little bit on the private practice as well, because it was interesting how you guys have sort of shifted in these times and the challenges of this year. But I was going to ask, going back to where you said about not intending to be in football, then you got into football, and then you got involved with it, you wanted to stay involved. What do you think that hook was? Do you think it was the performance side, possibly, that you preparing players to perform, you getting through the academy to the first team? What do you think it was that kept you there?
I think for me, what I found over the time is that when you first come into the environment, you start working with a group of players, and I think every practitioner of strength and conditioning, sports science, physiotherapist will relate to this. Often when you first join, your first group of players is very memorable for you. And I worked with a group of players that were really good, and that kind of hooked you into it. You developed a rapport with these players. That wasn't just about me, say, being a physio and making sure they were fit and healthy. You were developing them as a person, and you were part of their journey. And I think that's the hook that got me, is that over the years, you see these players develop as not only players, but as people. And over the years, I think as many people do, they recognize that our part in that is to develop them as a person. And I think for me, that was part of it. Mm-hmm. So that was a big pull. Also, you just start going deeper and deeper. As your knowledge builds, you started to venture into different areas of strength and conditioning, in sports science, in nutrition, in psychology, and you start developing. You think, actually, when I look back now on players 5 years ago, could I have done things better? So it was almost like every season was like a revolving door of improvement. And you wanted to change, you wanted to develop, and you wanted to change what you're delivering to the players. You wanted to change how the program was being run. You wanted to try new things, and probably for me that was the biggest hook. We were then able to implement things that perhaps weren't done before, and you just develop, and it was this continuous develop. That's probably what it was for me, and that's partly what it still is now. Is that actually we're constantly trying to develop the players. I'm lucky enough that I've been in football long enough now to. The players that I first worked with now, some of them are starting to retire now. That's the frightening prospect, is that I've been in football that long. But at the same time, it doesn't feel like I've been in football that long. But these players, we've got a mixture of players that have gone on to have very successful careers in the professional football world. We've also got players that have gone on to have incredibly successful careers outside of football, and have moved on to working in America, Wall Street, in these highly successful people. So we often then get messages from these books. We keep in contact with them, saying they have fond memories of their time here, and they've taken the principles of what they've learned as a young person and developed themselves into an adult, into being parents. And I for me, that's a huge pull of academy football, and we try to encourage with new staff and new members of students coming through that you're part of their journey. And whilst it is also a journey for you, you're part of their journey. So don't see yourself as I want to work in academy football because I want to work in first team football. See yourself actually developing people. And for me, that goes back to being a physiotherapist. As a physiotherapist, when someone sits down with you and they go, I'm in trouble, I've got some really nagging pain and I need to get rid of this, you're becoming part of their journey. So it all kind of links together for me. You take someone, you get to know them, you build a rapport with them, and you develop them as well as you, and you progress. So that, for me, that's probably a big reason as to why I stayed in football. much like many people in the east of England, there's not many clubs around us, so we tend to stay in our clubs really. So I'm a one club man effectively. I've been at Ipswich Town for way over 10 years now, and having a family locally, having everything based around this area, it's unlikely that I'm going to suddenly move to a different club very easily. So you then kind of get sucked into being really part of the club, and you develop the club alongside us trying to develop you. So yeah, it's as I say, I never wanted to work in football, but I've been here a long time now, so it obviously has a pull.
Yeah, definitely. And that's obviously something that Jay spoke about from Norwich as well, about the one club. And he spoke about the benefits of staffing changing, players changing. Yeah. So it is like being, as much as you're in the same environment, the same building, it is like being at different clubs, isn't it? Sometimes when the coaches are rotating and players are rotating.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to ask for yourself is, what do you think the main reason was the transition from physio to sports science or S&C? Because that's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because there'll be a lot of people out there that are maybe qualifying as physios and see themselves as physios long term, and it's just interesting. What was the reason for that shift?
There was, for me, they linked really heavily. So when I started, I was the physiotherapist. We didn't have strength and conditioning coaches. We didn't have sports scientists. It was kind of me and the coach. So you naturally morphed into doing a lot of it, whether you knew it or not at the time. And then as EPPP was a big factor in kind of encouraging more staff from sports science and strength and conditioning, as it grew, sports science grew in football. And so we naturally just morphed into it. So you might be taking players through their rehabilitation and their return to play, and things naturally just started falling in your lap about sports science. So I think for me, I was a physiotherapist that was heavily interested in the physiology and for example, training load monitoring, for example, because it formed a part of our rehab. You might assume that like your first few stages of rehab is predominantly physiotherapy based, but then it was nowadays you go, right, now we're going to pass over to the S&C staff, the sports scientists. At the time, it was us doing everything. So we probably just naturally morphed into doing it. And then the probably social media research just kind of perpetually grew sports science and strength and conditioning in everyone's minds. And it's just something I kind of fell into really. And we were doing it, we were talking more and more about it. And then as we got more and more of these staff in, it just became more and more part of the program. And I can remember very distinctly when we never used to do leg weights, and then all of a sudden we all kind of got to a point where, this is a long time ago, what are we doing? Like, why are we not doing this? And then we had to break down some barriers of coaches' perceptions. And we started to introduce things. And as soon as we started to introduce a lot of measures, it then just kind of snowballed. And kind of the sports science for me kind of grew, and the strength and conditioning grew even more so. And then as years go on, for me, they kind of all morph together as a practitioner. But even from a strength and conditioning perspective or a sports scientist, if we take on a new member of staff, we expect them to do the whole spectrum of it. So I'd expect a strength and conditioning coach to develop themselves, to understand the intricacies of the physiology of training loads and taking a player through rehabilitation and understanding how they're going to get a player from A to B, as well as doing all the strength and conditioning stuff. I expect them to do both. I also expect the same as from physiotherapists. So as a physiotherapist, which they might be very confident in those early stages, I would expect a physiotherapist to be able to do all the end stage rehab, because for me, that's part of the spectrum of the rehabilitation. So it's something that, for me, it's very interlinked. And I think that practitioners and sports scientists, S&C coaches, fitness coaches should also see it like that as well. Knowing their limits, so knowing where their responsibilities lie, but knowing when, and also knowing when to refer to the right people. But they should have an understanding, and they should develop themselves to understand the full spectrum. Because when you do, everything just makes far more sense in your head in terms of how we're going to take a player from A to B. It's not, I'm going to do this 2 stages and you're going to do the next 3. For me, it's actually, let's integrate it and work together. So I really enjoy the sports science and S&C side. And as a physiotherapist, I'm not afraid to jump in and kind of debate the S&C intricacies of doing certain things in the gym. And if an S&C coach says to me, all right, we're going to really focus on the Nordics, I'm going to go, why can't we look at the other aspects? Because there's when we look and we delve into different areas of research, there's so many different things we can focus on. So for me, if we can all have an understanding of the whole spectrum of sports science, strength and conditioning, kind of physiology really, then as a staff, we're going to grow.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. And I think that's how football is changed in the last few years, isn't it? This sort of integrated approach, and the fact that you've had sort of both roles and underline the importance of the understanding of both. I think that's something that's come up time and time again when we speak to people, is that understanding, which means that we can integrate well. And I don't know what you think, but I think years ago it was very much physio. And if there was any sort of fitness or fitness coach, they were very separate, weren't they? Same as a technical coach. They were all separate things. Whereas now we're finding that integrated model. And I think by the sounds of it, clubs like yours, like they're able to sink in really nicely.
Yeah, and I think the closer you work together, the more you push each other on as well. So we've had it where our S&C coach will come to us and go, what about this? And we'll go, fantastic. In an early stage, why don't we try this? And as the physio at the time go, do you know what? I've not thought of that. And you just constantly are snowballing ideas together. And the closer you work, the easier it is. And at the end of the day, it's all focused around the player. So if you are able to work together to push that player on, not necessarily quicker, because that might not be the answer, but to make them more robust, and you're doing that together, two heads is better than one, isn't it? So the more ideas we throw about, the better it's going to be. And I think, for a department like ours, which is in the east of England, there's not huge amounts of clubs, top sporting organisations around us. You have to be able to spur each other on to develop each other. So the more we can link between kind of the physio world, the sports science, S&C world, and nowadays it's the nutrition, it's the psychology, the emotional control. The more you link all of that together, the more you develop the player, the more you develop as staff.
And that was the next thing we're going to cover, is some of the key challenges that you face in your role, but also being where you are in the country. Because you mentioned that you're in an area where we are in the Northwest, there's clubs absolutely everywhere, but where you guys are, there isn't, is there? So how does that sort of affect how you guys work, and what are some of the other challenges that you face in your role?
I think so. Probably firstly, as a staff member, as I say, CPD opportunities are often pretty limited. So you have to start to think outside the box a bit. COVID in some ways has sped up CPD recently. So there's been so much, like yourself, there's been so much stuff out there that has allowed people to perhaps sit back and reflect and look at a few different webinars or podcasts or whatever it is. So for us, CPD is always an issue in the east of England. There's not a huge amount of things organised, but you have to think outside the box a bit. So for us, we linked with the University of Suffolk many years ago. They've been great for us to develop in terms of physiology and working with their S&C students and working with the staff there. But also talking to people at other clubs, and trying to give opinions, help, have discussions, have meetings as you've arranged before as well. So it's a challenge to do the CPD, but you have to be proactive with it, and use the club's opportunities. So for example, with us, it might be as a physiotherapist going to speak to some of the guys, top surgeons in London, and really getting the most out of those experiences, almost on the job CPD really. But otherwise, for a lot of people, it's when they're looking at, for example, if we advertise a job in the east of England, there's not that many people from an S&C perspective or a sports science perspective from based around here that have had huge amounts of experience. So we have to accept that we're not London, which will have an abundance of people, or like yourself towards the north that may have an abundance of people. In the east of England, there's not that many people with experience. So for us, we tend to look at it and go, okay, well, how can we help that? And if we're going to take on a member of staff, then that's something we'll have to take in mind and go, okay, how can we help develop them and give them more experience as well, if they're the right person for the post? As an academy, we're a Category 2 academy, so we're quite limited in our range to get players from. But we're actually quite lucky in some sense because there's not that many clubs around us. So there's Norwich, which is an hour and a half away at least. We've got Colchester, which is half an hour down the road. But our Suffolk, Paul, we're the only club in Suffolk, so we've actually got a big area to choose players from. So whilst we're a Category 2 and we may not be able to scale the entire country at young ages, we have quite a lot of players that are from the local area. And going back through our kind of Ipswich Town's history, our best players are from this area. We can go back through our Kieran Dyers of the world, the Titus Brambles, they're from Ipswich. And even our current crop of young players, they're probably from within about 40 minutes of Ipswich. So whilst it's a challenge as a club to kind of reach out and perhaps try and get some of the best players around the country, some of our better ones are actually still local. So we try and develop that, and we take that and we go, okay, well, this is all kind of this is the field of players that we can get. Let's focus on them then. And we're quite lucky as an academy in the sense that we produce football players and talented football players, and we'll focus on those. And that's kind of where our focus is as an academy. We will focus on the kind of the gene pool of Suffolk and the surrounding areas, and we'll develop them. So as a staff member, it has some challenges. As a football club, it definitely has challenges, but we try and utilize those to the best of our ability, really. So, but I think overall, if you're in the east of England, we would encourage people to reach out and talk to each other. And particularly even for students, we take a lot of students on. So for example, we take university work placement students. We don't tend to take postgrad interns because for us, it's about giving them the opportunity to develop so that when they do qualify as a sports scientist or S&C coach, they've got a good amount of experience under the belt already. That comes from our help with the University of Suffolk as well. And for us, this is all about you take what's around you, you make the most out of it. And whilst there may not be an abundance of finances for CPD, things like that, you have to think outside the box to try and develop yourself and utilize the people that are around you.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know if it's fair to say that because you don't have that abundance of players in the area, then obviously every academy's focus is going to be on development, isn't it? We're going to look at developing players to get them through the ages and make progress. But is it fair to say that because you don't have that abundance of players, there's an even bigger focus on that development, because you might not get the big line of players waiting to come in to replace the current ones that you've got?
Absolutely. Ipswich Town, we produce a lot of players that go into our first team. Many years ago, we set a target of 50% of our first team being academy. And currently we do that. We've got a lot of players that feature quite heavily for our first team now. And a number of players that have made appearances, and I think in the last 4 seasons or something, we've had 35 players make their debut from the academy. So there's a huge amount, and the pathway for the players and the attractiveness of Ipswich Town to players is there is the opportunity, and that is part of it in terms of its location. There is an opportunity. The club will play young players if they're good enough. So in some ways that does go hand in hand, because there's perhaps a limited pool of players. The importance of developing those players to ensure they play for our first team is really high in this academy. Our average age of debut at Ipswich Town is 17.
Oh, wow.
So that kind of shows you the emphasis that the club places on young players. They may not be playing regularly at 17, some do, but they're having those experiences very early on. So for us as an academy and the academy staff, it's fantastic to see these players develop. We have these players. We're not going to continually recycle and right, those players go, next one's coming. We're going to develop those players over a number of years. And at the moment, it's quite successful. We're getting a number of players into our first team. And being in League One is helping that, obviously. And if we were a Premier League club, it's definitely different. But for us as an academy, we're pleased that we're able to push these players through to the first team from a young age. and have the technical and hopefully, as they continue to develop as men, the physical ability to do it as well.
Mm-hmm. And then for coaches as well, because you mentioned before, obviously, about there not being as high numbers of S&C coaches, sports scientists. So in that regards, surely if coaches are in the area or willing to travel and move, then there's going to be more opportunity.
Yeah. And so I think so. And I think if you're an S&C coach or a sports scientist and you want to get experience, particularly in the east of England, as I say, whilst there may not be numerous hubs of kind of sporting facilities, the opportunity is there if approached correctly, really. And you build a rapport with the staff there, and you actually start to try and put yourself out there and gain the experience. I know I've spoken with Mark Armitage at the University of Suffolk, and we often talk about the level of experience. And for some people, they kind of get thrust into the sporting world very quickly, and they almost exhaust their experience really quickly before they've even got a job. They've experienced everything as a student, and that has its place. And I think for some people, they should look at what's around them. Okay, well, I know, for example, Mark Armitage will allow some students to come work at Lowestoft Town, for example, which is a good semi-professional football club, and they gain the experience of working with people in that environment before stepping into an academy. And then when they come into the academy, they've got experience of talking to people, they've got experience of talking to coaches and talking to other fitness or strength and conditioning or sports science people and physiotherapists, and building rapport with people, so that when they then come into an environment like an academy, they're able to kind of transition even easier. And for me, if someone comes to me and they're really pushing themselves and they're gaining experience and they're showing the willingness to learn, that's music to our ears, because we know we can start to impart some trust on them, and we're going to want to develop them. A number of people that we've had were students who started doing experience with us that now work with us full time. So, and that's not just in the strength and conditioning and fitness world, this is physiotherapy as well. So putting yourself out there, having those conversations with people, appreciating that sometimes sport is a volatile world and sometimes it's not on a plate. You have to keep trying to build the relationships. I'll hold my hand up. I might get a couple of emails, but I also get 50 other emails. So you have to be patient and you have to persist as well. I've had people who've emailed me and it's the third time that they've emailed me. And I'm like, yeah, I have seen your email. I just haven't had a chance to reply to you. But that persistency can help. So I think if you're in a situation where there's east of England, there's not many clubs around, having the willingness to talk to people, create the rapport, show the willingness to learn, will stand everybody in good stead. All right. Then there's the debate of should it be paid, should it be unpaid? That's a different story altogether.
Yeah, and possibly one that we won't dive into right now.
I think that's a whole nother podcast.
No, that's top though. I think that's great advice, and obviously real life from what you guys have done and are doing as well. So no, that's awesome. And we're going to sort of shift gears a little bit onto, and I think this is so relative for this season specifically because of the way that it's working out, the workload the players are going through, the fixtures, the scheduling is just crazy. Like, and I'm sure anyone working at clubs will appreciate that this is a massive challenge for this season. Understanding training loads and how that relates to injury risk as well. And it's obviously something that everyone's having to deal with, regardless of the level as well, because there's some semi-pro clubs that are going to be, hopefully some are going to get going again shortly, and their fixtures are going to be crazy too. So the full sort of spectrum of football is being hit by this, aren't they? So what are some things that spring out for you in terms of understanding training loads, how it relates to injury risk, and things that you've had to put in place?
I think it's been really interesting with COVID, and I know this is the same at a lot of other football clubs, is that perhaps our contact time with players is now less because we're trying to minimize contact and ensure COVID risk stays as low as possible. But even despite that, the principles of your training load and your periodization of what you're trying to achieve kind of relatively stays the same. The big thing for us is that we had to choose the big things that we wanted to keep, and we had to ensure that whole thing of bang for buck. We needed to make sure what we're doing is working. And what we did is through the lockdown period, the first lockdown, is that we spent as a staff a huge amount of time analysing, and we went back through years of data because we had the opportunity to. So we had a couple of months whereby we weren't in the building. So we were able to go back through all of our data. So we've been quite fortunate for a number of years to use StatSports GPS, for example. So we went through all of that information. We went through all of our force plate information, and we started to kind of delve deeper than probably what we could do in a normal closed season. And it allowed us to then compare that to what our injuries and kind of last couple of years worth of injuries that we'd had. So for us, what we were able to do is before we even came back from for this kind of pre-season post first lockdown, is we had a really strong idea of what we wanted to achieve with our training load. And this is where, for me, having the strong relationship with the football coaches becomes very important, and understanding your role as an academy becomes very important. So what I mean by this is ultimately we're developing football players, and we're developing young football players. And what we don't want to do is necessarily put limits on what they can do. For us as a staff, we've had lots of strong discussions and debates about training load. Is it too high? Is it too low? Should we be pushing them harder? Should we be pulling them back? When's the right time to push? When's the right time to pull them back? And ultimately, our philosophy revolves around the football coaches developing the player. So for example, we might choose on a certain day that we're going to do quite an extensive, high physical day. And the players are not getting the coaching point. And the coach might decide, I'm going to keep going until I get it, because I've got them in the zone. I need them to understand this, because we're out here, we're doing it, it's live, it's organic at that point. So as a staff, we have to understand, is there a limit? Should we be stopping them at a certain point, or should we be pulling them back? Or is the most important thing at that time to ensure that the coaching point and the coaching philosophy is live, is that the players are developing? If we were there going, no, sorry, we're going to have to leave the session there, that's no good to the player. That's not developing the player at all. So we have to understand our role in developing the player. And there's times to push and there's times to pull. And having that close communication with and understanding with the coaching staff is very important. So for example, we might choose to have a very low physical day, but actually quite quickly shifts into a high physical day. We're all out there, we're all understanding what's going on, and we're going to manipulate that later in the week, because the coaching aspect at that point is to develop the player rather than put a limit on them at that time. So taking that, what we did through the close season is we looked into our data, and we effectively split our GPS into zones, and we Z-scored it effectively from very low to very high. So very much like Laura Bowen's paper, where she's got very low to very high in terms of her acute chronic workload ratios and accumulated workloads. We did a very similar thing. And what we started to realize, whilst acute chronic ratios was one thing, our accumulated workload tells us a hell of a lot more than the acute chronics did. And what we started to find was actually, if we were able to identify the training loads that were keeping players in good condition, and we were able to identify if there's any training loads or situations that allow them to be at a higher risk of injury, we could then design our periodization to suit that and ensure that we're able to push the players on. But more importantly, we had bandings. So if a player was suddenly in a very high banding, we know there's a risk to that, but there's a banding to it. So they might creep into it. If they did an extra 500 meters of high speed running, does it really matter? Or if they did a 500 meters less, does it truly matter at that point? Because there's a banding within what they can achieve. So for example, one of our bits of data was that we looked at high metabolic load. So the combination of your high speed running, your sprint distance, and your explosive distance. So basically all your high intensity activities. And what we established is that in a Z-score fashion, if we kept them in a moderate low or a moderate high, pretty consistently, which makes obvious sense, then they're going to be in good condition. But when we look deeper, we actually found if we kept them in a 3-week cycle of that, so if we did moderate high, moderate high, moderate low, or if we did a moderate high, moderate low, moderate high, it didn't really matter. But if we cycled between those two, then what we found is our injury risk just dropped, significantly. Whereas if we were having players perhaps in a bit of a low chronic workload, and then they would jump up to it, or they might be in high, moderate, low, and then a low, their injury risk was going up. And we were finding that there was some obvious situations where if we didn't monitor their training load and keep them within a good boundary, then their risk of injury would go up. It sounds very simplistic and it sounds very obvious, but what it allowed us to do was actually really be very confident with the bandings. Similarly for total distance, which is an overall volume metric, if we keep them between a moderate high and a moderate low over a 4-week cycle, then we know we're going to be fine. Ultimately, it allowed us to then identify yes, that's our ideal. Let's keep everyone in that kind of periodization of moderate low, moderate high, perhaps. But what happens if we go into the high? Because the coaches have wanted to get a point. It then allows us to identify, right, actually, if we just drop them down to the lower point of moderate high or lower point of moderate low, then we know we're going to be okay. And then on top of that, it allows you to identify who's in those chronic workloads and who's in the low chronic workload. So we want to obviously try and get one into a high chronic workload and then stay within that, moderate high, moderate low. But what if a player is in a low chronic workload? And then allowed us to identify the boundaries to be able to nudge them up and get them into that high chronic workload. It became quite prescriptive for us. But what it didn't ever do was go, right, he's hit 1,000 meters of a high speed running, he's done. What it allowed us to do is give us leeway. And for me, that's where working with the football coach, you have to be very organic with it. You have to identify their priorities. They have to identify our priorities, and we have to work together to find that mix. What it also showed us is that some players can just work at a higher level. They're just athletes. So should we be pulling them down to the average? That's unfair on them, because we're trying to pull the low ones up to at least the team average. So for us, it's allowed us to identify a training load that reduces the injury risk, but is specific to the individual. Yeah. So if they are persistently chronic in their loading and their outputs are very high, then we know that's their norm and they're staying within those boundaries. If they're low, we've got somewhere to go, and we can identify and try and push them up to those levels. And then ultimately, that's our extrinsic factors that's going to reduce the injury risk as best as we possibly can. On the flip side, with young players, it's a learning process. And you get a young 16-year-old that comes into the building full-time for the first time, they're going to make mistakes and their communication may not be on point. So we then use this information to help guide them, and for them to be able to identify, I understand why I need to work consistently hard and why I need to consistently put the effort into training sessions, because it's going to help my risk of injury as a developing player.
Because if we're frank with it, where we talk about sports science, like limiting, if you get into a certain distance or speed or whatever it is, and you step in and you're right, that player's at that point, we need to drag them out. As from a coach's point of view, like you were talking about, if they've got something in their mind that they want to achieve, and you step in at that point and add your value where you think it's benefiting them, for a coach, it's a nightmare, isn't it? Because so for you to be reactive and adaptable in that situation and understand what they're trying to get and understand the benefits of what they're trying to do as well, but adapt your practice, that's the real key, isn't it?
Yeah. And ultimately it's all focused around the player, and that's the most important thing, is you have to develop the player. So we have to be confident in we know we're pushing their physical ability, and if that's fine and we know they're progressing and they're developing, doesn't matter if we slightly go above or slightly go below, if the most important thing at that point is their football ability, for example. So for me, it's about having that open communication with the staff and being able to put those points across. But the coaching staff also have to understand the limitations of it, and they can't go hell for leather. when it really isn't required. So it's an education process for everyone to understand that. And sometimes when we're talking about the coach taking over and perhaps going, well, they're very rare, by the way. There's extreme examples, but there's a time to coach and there's a time to push them on. There's a time to develop them and there's a time to pull back. So if you have that communication and the understanding, then it becomes very easy. Working with experienced coaches, it becomes very easy to identify those times because they will understand, right, I have to get this player. These players are not understanding what I'm saying. This is the most important thing at this point is their football ability, and I have to progress them. And as physical staff, we have to perhaps take a step back at that point rather than let our egos take a step forward. So the closer you work with people, the more you understand your data, the more you understand that there's buffers either side of that, and it's not the end of the world if they go above it. It really doesn't matter. You can easily manipulate it later in the week or the next week. And the more you communicate those things, the easier it becomes. And ultimately, it makes the players more robust. It reduces the risk of injury from an extrinsic point of view.
I think that is the key, and any coach listening should take that away, that the understanding of other roles is so key, isn't it? And that's why it's interesting for yourself that you've gone from physio into more of a sports science realm, but also the technical, the tactical side. You have to have an understanding of that as well, don't you?
Yeah, hugely.
Not in huge detail, but enough to respect that what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and when you start delving deeper and you start looking at the different types of training and how they can affect the physical outcome, we would often do, as many clubs do, they'll look at the different types of drills that they put on, for example. And we found one year that some of our passing drills were some of our most extensive drills. And we were going, but that's a low technical session. But actually, the movement they were doing in it was kind of masking, and we were thinking it's very low, but it turns out to be quite high. So you have to understand what the coaches want to achieve and then help them. So if they want to do a phase of play, a position specific type of work, then you can easily set the work rest ratios and the area sizes, and the GPS is going to tell you magical things about what they've achieved, and the coach has got every point that they want out of the football side. That's the holy grail. Everyone's working together really nicely. But also what we, going back through that period where we were then able to analyze and go a bit deeper, we strongly found that our key, almost big rocks, our really big success that we had over the last couple of years, and this has really come from our lead S&C coach, Harry Gell, was that we did sprinting, and we simply just microdosed sprinting, and we did it game day -1, and we did 2 40-meter sprints, and what we found was our high speed and sprint distance type injuries, so our non-contact hamstrings, they just didn't occur, and everyone just progressed in their max speed. So that the saying that speed kills, it literally it's our biggest rock in our program now. We have to ensure that is part, and the coaches know that now. So game day -1, we're doing a max speed session. We're building them up. So Harry, for example, our lead S&C coach, will go through their running mechanics, improve their sprinting ability, and then make sure that we're reaching those outputs via the GPS. And when we looked at our injury risks, we got to the high speed stuff and the sprint distance stuff, looking at those metrics, and was there any loadings, or was there any acute chronic ratios that really found, and it was just low as there was nothing. Literally, unless you were in a really low chronic workload and you'd done a big output and your injury risk was high, everything, it literally just went, oh, and it just went down. And there was just, even if you're working, we found in a very high chronic workload of high speed running and sprint distance, we just had very low risk of injury in non-contact hamstrings, adductors, quads. Those we just didn't, and we still don't get them really. So that was a big rock for us, is that we were able to then come into a post-COVID pre-season going, right, here's our bandings of our GPS, and this is what we want to try to do and periodize it. But by the way, we're going to max sprint them no matter what. So if we've only got them for a couple of hours a day, in 10 minutes, you can get your max speed stuff done, onto the football. So we were able to kind of microdose what we wanted to achieve, with the key things that we found. And it's been really helpful. We also found that some stuff was just pointless for us. So a really interesting thing we found was deceleration has told us nothing.
Right.
which is really controversial because a lot of people really focus on decelerations in terms of perhaps tendon loading, in terms of kind of the harsher explosive distance stuff. It didn't really matter for us. When we looked at our data, whether it be acute chronic loadings of it, whether it be accumulated workloads, it just didn't really tell us anything from an injury perspective. That's not to say it doesn't have its part in understanding it, but we just don't tend to focus on it too much now. We tend to focus much more on the combination of accelerations, decelerations, and the explosive distance type work. It's the combination of it, rather than just focusing purely on decelerations. Accelerations told us a little bit more, but for us, actually, it's everything joined together in terms of like a high metabolic load, all of your explosive work put together.
I think that's really interesting, both what you've taken and ran forward with post, well, if we are post lockdown, but on reflection, but also, like you say, I think it's really important at that time to critically analyze what you're doing and why you're doing things. And it's really interesting, isn't it, with the deceleration side of things. But when you were talking about that, it makes sense that if you use that integrated approach where you put in accels with decels with change of direction, that's what we do on the pitch. So yeah, it jumps out and makes sense. But
yeah, it might be as well that that's, you know, in their strength and conditioning loading, they're coping really well with it. They've got great eccentric braking force or something like that allows them not to have that problem at this club. It could be the type of training at this club that you know, we're very small game orientated, so there's already a lot of those things. They're conditioned to it, perhaps. That's our club. That certainly doesn't mean it's happening elsewhere. And that kind of leads me on to a really good point, is we analysed it from our club in terms of our training sessions. So for example, our under 23s have changed managers recently. Kieran Dyer's now come in with Terry Butcher to do our under 23s, and it's a slightly different type of training. So that means that actually it's going to be a slightly different output again. So we have to understand that and accept that there might be some limitations to that, or that we might have to change how we're monitoring it as well, because the players might be doing consistently different movements than they've done before. Really, all of it comes down to kind of understanding what you want to try and achieve and having that communication with the coaching staff. And that's something that we're constantly trying to push. And there is going to be debates. And this is, again, I'm starting to rant. Ultimately, there will be a debate. And I think debate is healthy. And if you're in an environment where it's very nice and everyone's open to communication, that's great. You have to disagree with each other every now and then, and you have to, for the purpose of developing the player. And that's something that has occurred over a number of years here, and our philosophy might change. But why? Why are you now changing to do it this way? And because we've developed and we've understood the data more here, and with the coaching staff, they might turn around and go, I don't agree. And we have to have that ability to have that conversation. And sometimes, as a staff, I've certainly done it. I've gone, do you know what? I think you're right, actually. And, you know, I was going down one path and they've steered me on another path. That is the nature of working with developing players. Every player is different. Every coach's philosophy might be different. So we have to have that constant push and pull between people for the primary purpose of developing the player for the first team, for example, as it is here.
I think that information is top. And I think coaches should take out of it that analyzing your work and your practice is really important. But as you've rightly pointed out, a lot of what you spoke about is very specific to your club and your findings. So it's not to say that that's going to be the same at other clubs. And it'd be great to get conversations going. If people reach out about their findings on deceleration or whatever it is, like that's what we need, isn't it? We need these conversations to get going, rather than them taking what you've just said and being like, well, that's the same as my club. Well, it might not be. Yeah,
absolutely. And for me, I think we get so bogged down in the detail of it that sometimes if you take a step back and you analyze it as a whole, then what you find is that the data becomes far more easier for you to look at. So that's what we found. We took the opportunity to delve a lot deeper. And then we stepped back from it and we went, well, actually, this gives us a really nice periodization model, allows us to have leeway within the program, but we know that leeway is not going to create too much of a jump in injury risk, or and for our staff, it becomes far more easier to understand. And, we might say, okay, we want the next 2 weeks, we're going to work very high in these areas, and then we're going to taper off. But coincidentally, a game gets put in, suddenly there's increased demands that week. Okay, well, where are we in terms of our injury risk? Is that a concern or not? And then you use that information to help guide the coaching staff, the players, and everyone, hopefully progresses onwards. It's not always easy, and you're constantly having these discussions, and we constantly are doing that with our coaching staff. So having that ability to understand your data but still push and pull away from it is important for me.
Yeah, brilliant. And just before we move into the quickfire, because I think we could talk all day on this sort of stuff, so I'll move it on to the next bit just before quickfire. One thing that you sent over when we were talking about some topics to discuss was having a family and working in football. And I think this is always a really good topic to cover, because there'll be loads of coaches that either got families that are currently working in football or looking to have families and still work in football. And it's a battle, isn't it? It's a tough, you're constantly trying to measure things up and give enough time to both. So it'd be really interesting to get your point of view on the sort of challenges in terms of time and everything that you face.
I think even before I had children, my wife, she used to call herself a football widow because of the nature of football. It's a harsh beast at times, but it's also quite addictive. So I remember when I first started, you were pretty much in 7 days a week. And I think as the years have gone on, that's improved, and people are understanding now staff's mental well-being is of utmost importance. So people are starting to understand that from an academy point of view as well, and even from a first team perspective, there has to be downtime, and there has to be an opportunity to step away from the football club, because it can consume your life. So for me, when my first daughter arrived, it was so obvious that I had to change how I worked, because you're managing staff. There's an academy, there's stuff going on during the day, there's stuff going on in the evening, there's stuff on Saturdays, there's stuff on Sundays. So you have to prioritize what you're doing. And for me, what happened was I very quickly realized that if I prioritize my key things and set myself the targets every day, what I was doing in a 12-hour day, I suddenly did in 8. Mm-hmm. Because I had a life that I wanted to be away from the football. I had my family at home that I wanted to spend time with. I'm not afraid to say I will spend as much time with my children as I possibly can, because they're of utmost importance to me. Mm. So what I would do is I'll prioritize what I'm doing at the club, and I will get, it's amazing what happens when you have children, when you suddenly realize you can cope on 2 hours worth of sleep and still do a full day's work.
So true.
You suddenly recognize that you're far stronger than you think, and you start getting things done a lot quicker. And there will be a point where I get everything I need to be completed that day done, and I suddenly realize I'm doing it far quicker than I was doing before. So you start to think like that. You start to speed up your work processes. You start to identify what's important, what's not, what's taking time up, that doesn't need to take time up, what needs to be delegated as a member of the management. And for me, working in football with children, it is tough. There was a period where I worked with the first team, and I was traveling away with the first team for a period of time. And that was really tough for me, because all of a sudden you were away a lot, and my family found it very difficult. So from an academy point of view, that's why I stepped back into the academy. You have to understand your working schedule and stick to it as best as you can, and be able to walk out the door and switch off. And yes, you still get the text messages, the WhatsApps, the phone calls, perhaps when you're not there. But if you can have the mindset where I leave the training ground gates and I'm switching off, and I'm devoting that time to my family, then it's going to be beneficial. So it's hard, but I think if you approach it in the right manner, whereby you prioritize, you organize yourself, and you become more efficient, then it can work quite easily.
I think that's another lesson of COVID. That's what COVID's taught us, isn't it? That, we could be working 12, 13, 14 hours a day, or like you say, we could be productive and get tasks done. And it's very different, isn't it, to measuring time or measuring productivity?
Yeah, definitely. And, for me personally, we opened a private physiotherapy practice over a year ago. And what we found was we then had to do that even more.
Yeah.
So whilst I'm still full-time in the football club, and I do some hours in this practice, and my wife does a hell of a lot as well. But we have two young children, they're 2 and 4 years old. So we then have to arrange our time to ensure that, you know, the girls are being looked after, or that we're spending enough time with them as a family, so that we don't get, you know, pulled into kind of never being at home and passing ships. So it's tough, but I think as you get older and more experienced, you recognize that you can very easily organize your time far better. And you also recognize that you probably spend far more time on your phone than you ever need to. Yeah. And social media can take over your life. And actually, there's a time to put it down and focus on your children and focus on your family and your wife and your other halves. And you know, it's been a good lesson for us over the last kind of 4 years of having a family, really.
I think you just pointed out the one thing that I've started doing more is putting the phone down and putting it to one side and focusing more and being present. So is that something that a change that you've made, you think, or is there something else that sort of springs out of a difference or a change that you've made?
It can still be a struggle, the social media side, because I think the Twitter or Instagram, there's so much stuff out there that I think for a lot of people, they feel like they're missing out. But something myself and my wife would do, particularly in a close season, we'd often, or if we went on a holiday, we would have a ban on social media. Yeah. And we'd have periods of being away from it. And what you very quickly realize is you waste a hell of a lot of time on it. Mm-hmm. And you would pick up the phone just because it's there, not because you genuinely want to look at it. So for me, it is about recognizing why you're looking at things like social media. And so we mentioned beforehand, like Twitter for me is actually a great CPD. There's so much information out there on it that you can use it to your advantage. But I don't particularly post too much now, but what I tend to do is like a hell of a lot. And I think to myself, I'll go back and look at that later. And as I say, I've probably got 3,000 likes I've never looked back at. But what it might do is trigger something in you, which is fantastic. And you delve into it. But other times you'll sit on something like Instagram and you flick away and an hour goes by and you think, what am I doing? What a waste of time. So I think if you can recognize it and understand it and start to self-reflect and understand what you should, you know, what's good for you and what's not, then I think, you know, it becomes far easier to manage your time.
Yeah, brilliant. So we'll move on to some quick fire questions. So to start with, who are some biggest influences on your career so far?
That's a tough one. So for me as a physiotherapist, I had a really, this was about 2010, I went on a workshop with Peter O'Sullivan. So Peter O'Sullivan is actually a physiotherapist that works in chronic low back pain, funnily enough. And I had kind of an epiphany moment whereby we were looking at how people move and changing people's behaviors and changing how people move when they're in pain. And for me, it was a really key moment in my development as a physiotherapist, but also working in the sporting world. Because what we were able to do is change how people move, change how they feel pretty quickly when we understand how they move and the psychosocial things around them. And this is relevant in the football and the sporting world because it's no different. We still get people that come in to our world who move perhaps how they shouldn't, or they show areas of weakness, or they show areas of altered movement control. But the reason for that is actually their understanding of it, or their perception of what they should be doing, their perception of normal. So for me, a big influence was this kind of research based around Peter O'Sullivan was actually, you've got someone who perhaps is moving differently and is actually now become a problem. And the way they're moving, because they think it's right, is wrong. And that's what's causing their problem. And when you take it into the sporting world and you take someone through rehabilitation, you start to use that information and you start to play with movement. You start to teach them, whilst their brain thinks movement is only this, it's this. So it can be a huge amount of movement that we want to teach them. So for me, a big influence was working with people in other specialities that could then link into the physiotherapy, the strength and conditioning world. And an example of that is I would take someone who perhaps will be on a long-term rehabber or even an acute one, and we might go in the gym and start doing some S&C type work, which might be low load, it might not be particularly heavy. But what we do is we start to change how they move, and we focus on the small intricacy. And I don't set limits on what they can do. So it's not 10 reps and then you're done, 3 sets. All of a sudden it's, no, you keep going. Right now you're getting it. Now let's move on. Let's make it look better. And before you know, you've done an hour's worth of even the same type of movement. It's not fatiguing. It's not damaging them in any way because we're working hard. What you're doing is you're reinforcing movement, and you're reinforcing their ability to move deep within their brain, looking at all your cortical tracts and really thinking about kind of developing the brain. So for me, it was taking people like Peter O'Sullivan's work, which is a completely different field, and applying it into our world, really. And for me, another area is really the development of social media and what's out there. And there's some good guys on social media that share all of the information there, and it makes you think. And that's a big thing for me, is actually sometimes you might just be having a look through Twitter and someone retweets something, a new bit of research, and it just tweaks you and you go, right, okay, I'm going to look into this a little bit more. So for me, overall, taking other people's specialities, looking and delving into the human body in different ways, applying it in your area and exploring it.
Real. Next one, I think this is my favorite one because it always makes people a little bit uncomfortable. What's your biggest strength as a coach?
Probably my ability to talk to them. As a physiotherapist in a football club, but also outside of a football club, is that you get to know the person very quickly, and that's really important. And within a football environment, as a physiotherapist, you often sit closer to the player than you do the coach. And we always used to say at Ipswich Town, there's a coach's table, there's a player's table. We kind of sit somewhere in between, because you have to be able to work with each individual. So a coach may be able to lay down the law and have a very strict process with the player. We can have that, but we also have to have the interpersonal skills and the closeness with the player to be able to develop them. So over the years, it's something that I particularly enjoyed, and I've enjoyed it going back into the private physiotherapy practice, is that closeness with that person and the interpersonal skills that brings, and being able to break down barriers and just to probe at the right point and question at the right point, or pause at the right point, let someone speak, let them give you your story, their story, and you formulate a good relationship with someone. So for me, that's something that I think is probably my biggest strength. And it's not just with players, it's with staff as well. So in a physiotherapy world, they always used to say you've got to be the friendliest with your admin staff, because they're the people that look after your diary. So you have to have this relationship and be very interpersonal with people. So probably for me, that's probably my biggest strength.
Now, this might be a tough one to narrow down because you've mentioned a little bit about it already, but is there any CPD that sort of stands out for you that you've done recently that sort of has been most impactful, whether that's like a webinar, whether it was a podcast, a blog, an article, some research? Like, is there anything that sort of stands out for you?
That's a tough one.
I thought it would be.
That's a tough one. Do you know what? Through lockdown, I thought there was some fantastic stuff out there, and there was a lot of webinars. And I think there was some about Evolve Performance. They were looking at the real details of perhaps force plate data, or looking much deeper into the Nordboard type work. So for me, I think one of the most impactful stuff for me recently is probably combining all of them. I'm kind of not really giving you an answer, am I?
It's fine.
But it's combining all of them. So you take the information. So for example, Dan Cohen did one on Evolve Performance, looking at the real intricacies of force plate data. And I have an affinity with our force plates here because I like to use it within the rehab. So I took that information, I took bits of research with that, and I kind of amalgamate it all together and formulate kind of my own opinion on it. And that's not giving you a direct answer, I know, but for me it's a bit of everything. But there are some fantastic things out there now, and I think COVID has really pushed it on exponentially. And I do think if you have the time to be able to sit down and look at these webinars and courses and CPD and things like that, and then reflect on it and ensure that you use it, because you can watch 100 webinars and forget all of them, within 100 days. For me, it's about taking it, understanding it, delving a bit deeper with it, playing with it, making your own opinion on it, choosing to keep it, choosing to go, actually, that's not for me. For me, that's part of the whole process.
Brilliant. And then last couple, what do you think the most important, or one of the most important traits is to have as a coach?
Okay. I think you have to be quite humble. And what I mean by that is I think you have to be able to understand your limitations, and you have to be quite reflective upon those. So if you understand that you need to develop your ability to communicate, or you need to build closer relationships with people, or you need to delve and focus a bit more on your professionalism or something like that, that is probably one of the biggest traits. If you can develop that, I think that's an exceptional quality. And by the way, it's something that takes years and years of work. But having that self-reflective habit is arguably one of the most important things to allow you to develop. And this isn't just for practitioners, it's for players as well. The most self-reflective players are arguably some of the most successful players. So, and it's the same in any big business. The most self-reflective people, the ability to identify their strengths and weaknesses and act on them, are arguably some of the most successful people. So, but alongside that, it's being willing to accept those as well. So if someone is saying to you that, actually, I think you haven't done that very well, it's being able to understand that and reflect on it. And it's not personal. You have to be able to progress yourself, and criticism is part of that. So for me, it's about being humble, being self-reflective, understanding your limitations and doing something about it.
And I think you might have answered this in that last question, but is there anything that you'd change in terms of the most important trait for a player, or anything additional that you'd add for a player?
Something that we've spoken about heavily here is ensuring good relationships. So for me, whilst being self-reflective and their ability to understand their strengths and weaknesses, it's also important for the player to be able to use that, but also with their parents, perhaps with their agents, and with the coach. And there has to be this relationship. So we talk here about a thing called the trilogy, which is player, parent, coach. And actually, if there's that ability to reflect, and everyone be able to reflect, then the player can develop. And that often comes from the player being able to be self-reflective. But a player's ability to be self-reflective is influenced by the parent. So if the parent isn't self-reflective, then often the child may not be. So we have to be able to have this ability for player, parent, coach, player, parent, staff member, player, parent, agent, staff, all of us to be working together. And if we can foster that self-reflection and that kind of self-efficacy from that, then you're going to have a successful player.
Brilliant. Jimmy, this was absolutely class. There's so much, it's just packed full of quality information, real relatable stuff, I think, for anyone working in the academy level, first team level, but all different levels as well. So thank you very much for giving up the time and coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to my ramblings.
No, superb. And do you want to just give, is there anywhere that if people want to reach out, if they've got any questions about anything, is there anywhere that you direct them?
So I'm on pretty much everything in Instagram and Twitter, Mr. Jimmy Reynolds. I have got a LinkedIn page, as even you found, my responses on it can be pretty sluggish, and similarly on email. But the best thing's probably Twitter or Instagram. So by all means, welcome for any conversations. And likewise, I'll put it out there, as we often do. If there's anyone in kind of the East Anglia region that wants to discuss and chat about things, then we are open to it. But just pester me if I don't reply. It's the wonderful world of sport can keep you busy.
Brilliant, mate. Well, really appreciate you giving up your time, and best of luck for the rest of the season, and we'll stay in touch.
Lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, mate.